The truth of suffering is the reality of suffering in life. The Buddha taught that life is suffering. Suffering is not just physical or mental pain, but includes all states of imperfection, dissatisfaction, and unease in life. For many, when they hear suffering, they immediately think of pain, loss, or great sorrow. However, the Buddha emphasized that suffering is not only about those big, obvious pains, but also the small, subtle changes in our daily lives that we often overlook. 1. Ordinary suffering, dukkha dukkha. This is the most obvious type of suffering, physical and mental pain. For example, illness, accidents, the loss of loved ones, and personal crises. These events cause direct suffering that we can easily recognize. 2. Suffering of change, viparinama dukkha. This suffering arises from change. Everything in life is constantly changing. The things we love and become attached to will also change or disappear over time. That's why we feel pain when something beautiful or good comes to an end, such as when love fades, youth passes, or health deteriorates. 3. Pervasive suffering, sankhara dukkha. This is the most subtle type of suffering, the suffering inherent in existence itself. Just by existing, we are subjected to impermanence and the constant change of both mind and body. The cause of suffering. After realizing that life is suffering, the Buddha identified its root causes. This led to the second truth in the Four Noble Truths, the truth of the cause of suffering, tupde. However, within the scope of Khổ Đế, we will focus on understanding the deep-rooted causes of suffering. Craving, tanha. Craving is the desire to acquire, to hold on to, or to reject things we dislike. When we are deeply attached to craving, we feel disappointment and suffering when we don't get what we want, or when we lose what we possess. Ignorance, avijja. Ignorance is the lack of understanding or blindness to the true nature of life. We often mistakenly believe that life is eternal, that the things we have will last forever. This ignorance prevents us from recognizing impermanence, from seeing the truth of suffering, and from causing even more mental anguish. Understanding the truth of suffering, the key to liberation. The Buddha taught that recognizing and accepting the truth of suffering is the first crucial step in the path of practice. This does not mean that we must live in sorrow or pessimism, but rather that we need to have a realistic perspective on life. Recognizing the truth of suffering is not for us to endure it, but to help us understand its nature, and from there, find ways to overcome it. Mindfulness and awareness. When we practice mindfulness, we start to recognize our emotions, thoughts, and mental states. Mindfulness helps us recognize suffering as soon as it arises, and instead of being swept up in it, we can stand outside of it, observing it as a natural phenomenon. Acceptance of impermanence. When we understand that everything in life changes, we begin to let go of our attachment to uncertainty. Accepting impermanence is an important step toward liberation from suffering. When something good happens, we appreciate it and know it won't last forever. When something unpleasant happens, we know it will also pass. Cultivating compassion and wisdom. Wisdom helps us realize that the nature of life is impermanence and suffering. Compassion helps us face the suffering of ourselves and others with gentleness and understanding. Compassion allows us not to close our hearts when facing suffering, but to open them up to embrace and resolve it. How to practice to overcome the truth of suffering. Meditation. Meditation helps calm the mind, allowing us to recognize and face negative emotions and thoughts. Through meditation, we can deeply examine the nature of suffering and learn not to be consumed by it. Meditation is a powerful method that helps us identify and overcome suffering. Living by the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is the path of practice the Buddha outlined to help us escape suffering. This includes right view, seeing correctly, right thought, thinking correctly, right speech, speaking correctly, right action, acting correctly, right livelihood, living correctly, right effort, striving correctly, right mindfulness, remembering correctly, and right concentration, focusing correctly. When we practice according to the Noble Eightfold Path, we gradually reduce the suffering in our daily lives. Cultivating loving kindness and compassion. Practice compassion not only towards ourselves, but also towards everyone around us. When we treat ourselves and others with kindness, compassion dissolves negative emotions, helping us to suffer less. Benefits of understanding and practicing the truth of suffering. Reducing anxiety and fear. When we understand that suffering is an inevitable part of life, we reduce anxiety and fear when facing challenges. Instead of panicking, we can face them calmly and wisely. Living more peacefully. When we are no longer controlled by suffering, we live a more peaceful life. Understanding the truth of suffering doesn't make life gloomier, but helps us recognize the truth, allowing us to live more lightly with everything that happens. Experiencing inner freedom. When we are no longer bound by endless desires, we experience inner freedom. This is the first step on the path to liberation that the Buddha pointed out. The truth of suffering is an undeniable reality in life, but it is not something that should discourage us. Understanding the nature of suffering opens the path to liberation from it. The Buddha taught that only when we recognize and accept suffering can we overcome it. Life is always full of things that don't go as we wish, but with the right understanding and practice, we can live a life of peace, freedom, and greater happiness.